I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. China did not release any information today on what happened at the trial of Canadian Michael Kovrig. Foreign Affairs Minister Marc Garneau says the government is deeply troubled by the total lack of transparency and is continuing to work toward an end to the arbitrary detention of Mr. Kovrig and Michael Spavor. The Canadian Embassy's Deputy Chief of Mission, Jim Nicol, remained outside the courthouse until after dark, waiting for information. China says the trials are being conducted behind closed doors because they involve state secrets. Beijing is seen as using Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor as leverage to obtain the release of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou, who was arrested in Vancouver at the request of the U.S. in December 2018. The nation's leading physician says the vaccine rollout has resulted in a drop in cases in people 80 and over. Dr. Teresa Tam says the reduction offers reassurances that vaccines will bring more and greater benefits in the weeks to come. The provinces are reporting 91,952 new shots in arms for a total just shy of 4 million doses given. Canada's COVID-19 case count is 933,785. The virus has claimed 22,676 lives across the country. Well, with more and more vaccine shipments arriving in Canada, provincial and territorial health officials are expanding their COVID-19 vaccination approvals. Several provinces will now begin to offer COVID-19 shots to a broader range of age groups. Ontario residents aged 75 and up can now book vaccines through the government's online system, and some pharmacies and family doctors can administer the Oxford AstraZeneca shot to anyone 60 or older. Quebec is expecting to start vaccinating people 65 and up in Montreal area pharmacies today. In eastern Canada, New Brunswick is stepping up a program to vaccinate high school teachers against COVID-19 and plans to have 4,500 staff members get their first shots this week. Meanwhile, health officials in Nova Scotia say that the province has tallied an additional 6 new cases of COVID-19. They're also issuing an exposure alert for 8 locations in the Dartmouth area, which are mostly supermarkets. And Newfoundland and Labrador is down to just 5 active cases after a weekend with 0 new infections reported. The federal New Democrats will be looking for help in an effort to convince the government to eliminate for-profit long-term care. Expected to get tabled today, the motion would call on the government to transition existing for-profit homes into not-for-profit operations by 2030. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said he respects provincial authority when it comes to long-term care and supports the sector through billions of dollars in additional funding allocated to provinces during the COVID-19 crisis. Relatives of a young Indigenous man shot and killed on a Saskatchewan farm are expected to address findings from a watchdog's review that concluded RCMP racially discriminated against his mother, asking if she had been drinking and telling her to get it together. A commission also says Mounties failed to protect the SUV that Mr. Bushi was in when he died, resulting in the loss of blood spatter and other evidence. The National Police Federation Union says the watchdog report generally shows police did a professional investigation and questioned the finding on discrimination. Roman Catholic parishes in the St. John's, Newfoundland area will soon hear more about what properties will be sold to compensate victims of abuse at Mount Cashel Orphanage. St. John's Archbishop Peter Hunt sent a letter over the weekend to say a major restructuring of parishes and the diocese is in works. He says parishes should expect to see some properties listed on the real estate market in the weeks to come. The bishop also says in the letter that information is still being gathered and decisions will be communicated to individual parishes as they are made. Alberta's premier says he has been assured that Canadian Pacific Railway's deal to buy U.S. rival Kansas City Southern will not result in job losses in Calgary. Jason Kenney tweeted that he has been briefed by the companies and says Calgary will remain the global headquarters for the merged firm, while Kansas City, Missouri, will house its U.S. headquarters. He says the combined rail network will allow CP to seamlessly transport Alberta energy directly to Gulf Coast refineries. Experts say a solution to North America's polarizing pipeline battles will likely come not from the courtroom, but from the classrooms producing the next generation of oil and gas leaders. Peter Tertzakian, an energy economist and business professor at the University of Calgary, says young people coming into the industry are very smart and energetic, but also frustrated and confused because of the negative stigma around the business. He says the challenge going forward is to reframe the pipeline debate to focus on which companies should be the ones meeting the ongoing demand for fossil fuels. This past week, we looked at the court proceedings in Beijing, China, in the case of Canada's Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. We spoke with Mr. Charles Burton, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. More on this story when we return on the Forum Daily Week in Review. Former diplomat Michael Kovrig was put on trial yesterday in Beijing on spying charges. As was the case with fellow detainee Michael Spavor's trial last Friday, Canadian officials were barred from the courtroom. No verdicts have been announced, and Canadian diplomats were denied access to the trials because of alleged national security concerns. However, it is still unclear if the two Canadians will have additional hearings following their first court appearances after 2 years in custody. It is widely believed that Beijing is using the pair as leverage to obtain the release of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou, who was arrested at Vancouver's airport in December of 2018 at the request of the U.S. Meanwhile, the opposition is denouncing the Liberal government's handling of the case of the two Michaels. Well, to talk more on the recent developments in the detention of the two Michaels, we are joined by Mr. Charles Burton, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Always great to have you on the show, Mr. Burton.
Very nice to speak with you, Nima.
Now, all eyes are on these trials in Beijing, but Canadian officials can't enter the courtroom. So what information has China released so far?
Well, nothing really. We assume that they will be convicted, but the verdict has not been handed out. And we also don't know when sentencing will be handed down. So really, from our point of view, it's more or less a non-event. Mr. Kovrig and Mr. Spavor came out of prison, went to this process that we know nothing about. Had no opportunity to defend themselves. We don't know really what the details of the charges are. And they go back to prison. And my speculation would be they will stay in prison until such time as the Chinese government feels it's in the interests of China to release them. So, it's an unfortunate sequence of events and really a travesty of the principles of justice and due process of law.
Now, considering that this whole detention is widely viewed as retaliation from China over the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, how likely are the trials of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig going to be connected to the outcome of Ms. Meng's case?
Well, I think that certainly it's possible that if some sort of deferred prosecution agreement is worked out between the American government and Ms. Meng and the Huawei company, that that we might be able to put in a rider requiring the release of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. But if the judicial process continues according to normal Canadian law, in other words, that the determination of whether or not Ms. Meng's extradition request under the extradition treaty is valid, and it's found it's not valid, and she's therefore free to go, I don't think that we'll necessarily see the release of Kovrig and Spavor because the Chinese government continues to want to express their displeasure with Canada over our arrest of a senior Chinese member of the Chinese Communist Party, and because it seems to be serving their interest in Canada, because it's constrained the Canadian government from taking much substantive action against the Chinese regime for various violations of the ordinary rules of the international order.
Now we have opposition leaders criticizing the Liberal government's handling of this matter. Was there a better way to go about handling the situation?
Well, I wouldn't want anyone to think that the horrendous fate of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor is due to the Canadian government. I mean, clearly it's on the heads of the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party that they've been subject to brutal incarceration for such a long time. But clearly our original policy of quiet diplomacy, which is do nothing to displease the Chinese regime while engaging in backroom negotiations, hoping to have the Chinese Communist regime see reason and act with goodwill and release Kovrig and Spavor, has failed because, after all, they've now been imprisoned for 833 days. So I think that the opposition is right to demand that our government review our China policy and see if we can make some changes to give the Chinese government incentive to release Kovrigan's favor and in general to abide more by the norms of reciprocal, fair, and just interchange in global affairs.
Now, we've got about 45 seconds left, sir, but dozens of diplomats from 26 countries sent representatives in Beijing to show their support. Is there any way that we could utilize this international support in our efforts to return the two Michaels?
I think it's heartening to see so many diplomats accompanying our chargé d'affaires, Jim Nicol, at the courthouse, standing around for hours in the cold. In April, the U.S. will be convoking a summit of democracies where ostensibly the idea is to protect the norms of the international rules-based order. But what it really is a lot of our like-minded allies coming up with some coordinated action to give the Chinese government pressure to get more into compliance with norms of diplomacy.
The first real-world study on the effect of COVID vaccines on cancer patients indicates that delaying the second dose might not be the best choice for this demographic. The study by King's College London and Francis Crick Institute examined the immune response after one shot of the Pfizer vaccine and found that individuals with solid or blood cancers had an immune response between 13 to 39%, compared to 97% for those without any cancer. Following the second dose of the vaccine, 3 weeks after the first, cancer patients had a much stronger immune response against the coronavirus at 95%. However, for cancer patients who had to wait longer, about 5 weeks for their second dose, the antibody response was between 8 and 43%. On Monday, in a TV interview, Canada's top scientist, Dr. Mona Nimer, had advised against delaying the second dose for seniors to 4 months, claiming that the research isn't there to justify this delay for seniors and those with pre-existing conditions. Well, to talk more on these developments in our TIA Health medical segment, we are joined by Dr. Abhishek Raut, medical director at Appletree Medical Group. Always great having you on the show, Dr. Raut.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, what can we take away from the findings of this UK study into cancer patients?
I think the most important takeaway point here is that certain groups, those with blood cancer or solid cancer, don't really respond the same way as those without these conditions. We know for cancer treatments can have significant effects on the immune system as a whole, and patients with these comorbidities would not necessarily be able to mount a strong resistance against COVID-19 without getting both shots in a relatively faster amount of time.
And do we know why the immune response of cancer patients is so different compared to those without any cancer?
There's two real points here. Cancer cells really develop from our own cells. So our immune system sometimes has a hard time finding out which cells are the cancer cells and which cells are our own cells and don't necessarily attack them. Oftentimes the immune system won't even notice the cancer cells there, and so cancer cells can also have the ability to turn off certain aspects of our immune system. The second is actually the treatments. The chemotherapy, the radiation therapy can affect bone marrow, and that's where our immune system is created. So once those are affected, the immune system's ability to really fight infections or mount an immune response with the vaccine significantly drops.
So how does this research speak towards the vaccine's effect on people with other pre-existing conditions?
I think this is a great point here. While the study we're describing really focused on cancer patients, the truth is we have many other patients who would have a similar drop in immune systems. These are the same patients who likely would get hospitalized more often for COVID-19. According to COVIDNet, which is CDC's hospital survey network, the most common comorbid conditions that affect hospitalization with COVID-19 are asthma, cardiovascular disease, cancer, chronic lung disease, diabetes, hypertension, and obesity.
Now, to add to all of this, we have Dr. Mona Nimer, Canada's top scientist, advising against delaying the second dose of vaccines for seniors and those with pre-existing conditions. Why is she advising against this move? And she also mentioned seniors as well. Why this demographic as well?
That's right. So remember, Dr. Nimer is Canada's chief science advisor. So she's looked extensively through the clinical trials of the vaccines and the efficacy data. And what she said is she's actually not aware of any data that specifically shows efficacy beyond the first 2 months of the first dose. And we are now starting to see some data that shows that those who are elderly, those who are immune compromised, actually don't have much of an immune response after 2 months with one dose. So based on this data and the data we're getting out of our cancer patients here, it does make sense to look at vaccinating to completion very high-risk and immunocompromised groups.
Now, on top of this, we know that vaccine manufacturer Pfizer has also spoken out against delaying the second dose past the 21-day interval. How should Canadians react to all of this contradicting information here?
I think that's difficult for sure. We know that Health Canada initially advised 21 days for Pfizer, 28 days for Moderna, and AstraZeneca had said 12 weeks. NACI came to the decision to extend the intervals after looking at the real-world effectiveness. And given that there were significant vaccine supply shortages at the time, it does make sense for NACI to have pushed all vaccines to 12 weeks to immunize as many as possible. Otherwise, we would have a situation where you have 1% of the population completely vaccinated and the others just waiting.
All right, sir, about 30 seconds left. But how can we improve our current vaccination plan to ensure the vulnerable people in the population get the vaccines protection that they deserve?
Fair enough. So the first real step here is we have to recognize all of this is stemming from one issue, which is vaccine supply. If we had enough vaccines, none of our agencies would be even debating extending. So the priority number one is really to ensure enough vaccine supply for all Canadians who can get their doses in a timely manner. And then second, what the studies are telling us is there's no one-size-fits-all approach to vaccination. We need to look at the high-risk groups and the groups with the weaker immune systems and prioritize them first.
The U.S. Treasury Department says it has sent out another $37 million economic impact payments over the past week. That brings the total disbursed in the past 2 weeks to $325 billion U.S. The second batch of payments sent out this week followed an initial $90 million payments made in the week after President Joe Biden signed the $1.9 trillion COVID relief measure on March 11th. The head of the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention today warned against a vaccine war among nations amid renewed fears that the COVID-19 vaccine shipments to the continent face delays. The center chief was referring to reports that the Serum Institute of India is suspending major exports of the AstraZeneca vaccine in order to meet rising demand at home. Canada is also among countries expecting such shipments from the Serum Institute of India. There is still no movement of a skyscraper-sized cargo ship wedged across Egypt's Suez Canal. The accident continues to delay global shipping today, as at least 150 other vessels needing to pass through the crucial waterway remain idled, waiting for the obstruction to clear. The Evergreen, a Panama-flagged ship, ran aground on Tuesday. The ship's Japanese owner today offered a written apology for the incident, which is affecting billions of dollars worth of cargo. Protesters against last month's military takeover in Myanmar have returned to the streets in large numbers. Today's protests came a day after a silent strike in which people were urged to stay home and businesses to close for the day. An online news service based in eastern Myanmar reported 4 staff members were detained on Wednesday night, including its publisher and editor. It is the junta's latest attack on press freedom. The Philippine military has ordered more Navy ships to be deployed in the South China Sea, where a Chinese flotilla has swarmed around a disputed reef and ignored Manila's demand to leave the area. Philippine Defense Secretary Declan Lorenzana has asked about 200 Chinese vessels he described as militia boats to immediately leave. China ignored the call, insisting that it owns the offshore territory and that the vessels were sheltering from rough seas. Vote tallying in Israel has returned, with neither Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu or those determined to topple him gaining a clear path to forming a government. With around 93% of the votes counted today, neither the pro-Netanyahu camp nor his highly fragmented opponents gained 61 of the 120 seats in parliament. Mr. Netanyahu and his allies had projected 52 seats compared to 57 held by his opponents. In the middle are 2 undecided parties, Yemina, a 7-seat nationalist party, and Ram, an Arab Islamist party that won 4 seats. South Korea's military says North Korea fired 2 unidentified projectiles into its eastern waters on Thursday. It is reviving testing activity to expand its military capabilities and pressure the Biden administration amid a stalemate in diplomacy. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff say the U.S. and South Korean militaries were analyzing the launches. It didn't immediately say whether weapons were ballistic or how far they flew. Two men trapped in vehicles have become the first fatalities of record flooding on Australia's east coast. While rain has eased across New South Wales and southern Queensland, flooding has persisted. Officials say most rivers had peaked by Thursday, but 20,000 people are still evacuated from their homes. Thousands of Venezuelans are seeking shelter in Colombia this week following clashes between Venezuela's military and a Colombian armed group in a community along the nation's shared border. The Colombian government on Wednesday said 3,100 people have moved from Venezuela to Colombia since Sunday in search of protection from the conflict in the border state of a poor Venezuela. Authorities in Colombia have set up 8 shelters to host the influx of people. A Georgia man says he was given $915 worth of pennies as a form of payment from his former employer. Andres Flatten left his job at AOK Walker Auto Works in November, but says he had difficulty getting his final check and turned to the Georgia Department of Labor for help. Mr. Flatten says he was shocked to see a pile of oily coins at the end of his driveway. On top of the pile was Mr. Flatten's final pay stub and an explicit parting message. Shop owner Miles Walker says he doesn't remember dropping off the pennies. A Banksy painting honoring Britain's health workers in the coronavirus pandemic has sold for a record $23.2 million US. The artwork by the Mystery Street artist, titled Game Changer, first appeared on a wall in Southampton General Hospital in May. The black and white picture depicts a young boy sitting on the floor playing with a nurse superhero toy. Auction house Christie's said that proceeds from the sale will be used to fund health organizations and charities across the UK. The sale price was a world auction record for Banksy. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news from this past week. Remember, for news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and follow us on our social media platforms. Take care.